Before he ever stood in a classroom at Hogwarts as a respected professor, Remus Lupin was a child marked by something the wizarding world barely dared to speak about, a condition that did not just change his body, but slowly shaped every part of how he would learn to see himself and others. Hidden behind careful choices made by his parents, and later guarded by powerful magic and even greater silence, his childhood unfolded in ways most students never experienced, filled with separation, fear, and moments of quiet resilience that left deep traces on his life. But what makes his story truly unsettling is not only what happened to him, it is how early it began and how long it stayed with him, shaping the man he would eventually become in ways he could never fully escape, the boy born under a curse. Before there was any understanding of who he was meant to become, before any classroom, friendship, or name spoken with respect or fear, there was only silence surrounding a small child named Remus Lupin, a silence so deep and heavy that it seemed to arrive even before his own memories had fully formed, as though the world had already decided that his story would begin not with laughter or discovery, but with something far more uneasy and uncertain. He was born into a magical world that often looked bright on the surface, filled with moving staircases, enchanted ceilings, and talking portraits. Yet beneath that wonder, there were rules and fears that shaped how people treated anything they did not fully understand. And in that hidden layer of fear, there existed a condition called lycanthropy, a transformation tied to the full moon, something that could turn a wizard or witch into a wolf-like creature against their will, leaving them with no control over their actions during those nights. And while it was spoken of in books and warned about in classes, it was rarely discussed with kindness, because most people only saw danger instead of the person living through it. For Remus, this condition was not something he chose or ever asked for. It was something forced into his life before he was old enough to form clear thoughts, because when he was still very small, an event occurred that would shape everything that followed. An attack carried out by Fenrir Greyback, a name known in dark corners of the wizarding world, someone who did not simply see lycanthropy as a burden, but as something to spread deliberately, believing that children were the easiest way to expand his twisted belief that becoming a werewolf was a kind of strength rather than a curse. And in one moment of violence that no child could ever understand, Greyback changed the direction of Remus's entire existence. There were no dramatic warnings before it happened, no signs that the world was about to split into before and after, only the ordinary fragility of childhood that should have been filled with soft voices and warm rooms, but instead became the setting for something cruel and irreversible. And even though Remus himself would not remember every detail of that moment later in life, the impact of it was written into everything that came after, like an invisible mark that shaped how others saw him and how he would eventually see himself. His parents, Reis Lupin and Hope Lupin, were not people who lacked understanding of the magical world. In fact, they both knew enough about its dangers to realize how serious this situation was, especially Reis, who worked at the Ministry of Magic and had once spoken strongly against dark creatures, believing in strict boundaries between safety and danger. Yet nothing in his knowledge had prepared him for something so personal, something that would not remain in books or reports, but instead live inside his own home, growing up as his son. And so, the moment they learned what had happened, their lives changed into something carefully structured around protection, secrecy, and constant worry. They made choices quickly, not because they were cold or distant, but because fear forces decisions to be made faster than comfort allows, and so they tried to build a life where Remus could survive, even if that meant he would not live freely in the way other children did. And from the very beginning, his childhood became shaped by careful planning around the full moon, which arrived once every month like a reminder that something within him would always be uncontrollable, no matter how kind or intelligent or gentle he became during the rest of his days. In the wizarding world, lycanthropy was not treated like a simple illness that needed care and patience, but instead, like a dangerous condition that made people uneasy. And even those who claimed to understand it often kept their distance, because fear tends to speak louder than knowledge when safety feels uncertain. And so families affected by it often lived in isolation, hiding their reality from neighbors, friends, and even extended relatives, which meant that Remus grew up learning very early that some parts of himself were not meant to be spoken about outside his home, not because they were shameful in truth, but because the world had decided to treat them that way. The attack by Fenrir Greyback became the unseen foundation of everything that followed, not because Remus could recall it clearly, but because others remembered it for him, and because every decision made afterward was shaped by preventing its consequences from spreading further. And Greyback himself was known for choosing moments when children were vulnerable, often placing himself near them during times when the full moon was approaching, so that the transformation would occur under his influence, a detail that made his actions even more disturbing to those who understood them, since it was not random violence, but something calculated and persistent. For Remus, this meant that his life began under a kind of inherited fear, where people did not simply see a boy, but also saw the condition that came with him, even when they tried not to. And this created a strange distance between him and the world, as though there was always a layer of glass separating him from normal childhood experiences, where other children might run freely, argue over games, or stay out late under supervision, while he instead lived according to a rhythm that matched the lunar cycle, waiting for nights that would take him away from himself in ways he could never control. Inside his home, his parents worked to create safety through structure, and structure through secrecy, and secrecy through silence. And this cycle became the invisible architecture of his early life, where doors were locked not out of punishment, but out of necessity, and where certain nights of the month carried a heaviness that even a child could feel without fully understanding. Because even when no one explained everything in detail, children are often sensitive to emotional changes in their environment, noticing when voices become quieter or when routines tighten into strict patterns. As he grew slightly older, there were moments of curiosity, moments when he asked questions that his parents answered carefully, not with lies, but with softened truths that a young mind could carry without breaking. And yet even those softened truths carried weight, because learning that part of yourself could cause harm without intention is not something easy for any child to process, especially when that understanding arrives before the ability to fully separate identity from action. The wizarding world outside his home continued to function as if nothing unusual was happening. Students attended schools, shops remained open in Diagon Alley, owls delivered letters across great distances, and yet somewhere within that larger system, Remus's existence remained carefully hidden, not because he was being erased, but because visibility in his condition often led to fear, and fear often led to exclusion, and exclusion could make survival even harder than the transformation itself. There were times when Reis Lupin, despite his strong opinions about magical creatures, found himself confronting a reality that did not fit into the simple categories he once believed in. Because when something affects your own family, it stops being theoretical and becomes deeply personal. And Hope Lupin, with her quieter strength, became the emotional center of the household, holding together the softer parts of Remus's childhood, making sure that even within strict routines, there were still moments of warmth, stories, and gentleness that reminded him he was still a child and not only a condition. Yet even with all their efforts, there remained something unavoidable in Remus's early life, a sense that time itself was divided into two types of days, those that were ordinary and those that were approaching the full moon. And as he grew older, this awareness became more present, not as fear exactly, but as anticipation mixed with uncertainty, like waiting for a storm that you know will come but cannot stop. What made his early existence even more complex was that he had no point of comparison, no memory of a life without this condition, which meant he could not imagine what it felt like to be fully free from it. And so instead of longing for something he had lost, he simply grew into understanding what was always there, learning to measure his days not only by play or meals or sleep, but also by invisible timing that others did not need to think about. There were nights when his parents would prepare in silence, checking protections around their home, making sure nothing could be accidentally harmed. And though Remus did not always see everything that was done, he felt the shift in atmosphere, like air becoming denser, like the world itself preparing for something that only he was connected to. And in those moments, even without full understanding, he began to form a quiet awareness that he was different in a way that carried consequences beyond himself. And yet, despite all of this, there remained a fragile thread of normal childhood within him, because children are remarkably resilient in ways that do not always appear dramatic. And so there were still moments when he asked simple questions, showed interest in small objects, or listened carefully to stories told by his mother. And in those moments, it was possible to forget, even briefly, that his life carried such a heavy undercurrent. But the world outside his home did not forget, because institutions and societies tend to remember categories more than individuals, and lycanthropy was placed into a category that triggered caution rather than care, which meant that Remus's future, even as a child, was already being shaped by assumptions made by people who would never meet him, and that invisible judgment became another layer of isolation, one that existed even when he was surrounded by family. As he moved through his earliest years, still too young to understand the full meaning of what had been done to him, there was already a quiet formation of identity taking place, not through choice, but through repetition, through routine, through the steady rhythm of preparation and recovery that marked each cycle of the moon. And though he could not yet describe it in words, his life was slowly becoming a study in endurance, where survival itself was not dramatic, but quiet, ongoing, and deeply personal. And so, before he ever stepped into the wider magical world, before he ever met other children who would one day become his closest companions, before he ever learned how to turn fear into quiet strength, Remus Lupin's story had already begun in a place shaped by hidden danger, careful love, and an understanding that some parts of life cannot be changed, only carried. And it was from this beginning, so quiet and so heavy at the same time, that everything else would eventually unfold. A family shaped by fear and protection. The life that surrounded Remus Lupin did not form by accident, and it was not built in calm conditions either, because it was shaped inside a home where love existed, side by side with constant caution, where every decision carried both emotional weight and practical risk, and where two adults tried to raise a child while also holding back a truth that could easily change how the outside world would treat him. And to understand how that environment formed, it is necessary to look closely at the people who stood at its center, starting with Reis Lupin, a man who worked within the Ministry of Magic, in a position that required him to study and evaluate magical threats, especially creatures that were considered dangerous or unpredictable, a role that made him knowledgeable but also firm in his beliefs, because over time he had developed strong opinions about how dark creatures should be controlled or contained for the safety of others. Before Remus's life became the focus of his world, Reis Lupin saw magical creatures in structured categories, often through the lens of safety reports, official discussions, and ministry guidelines, where the focus was less on individual experience and more on general risk. And this perspective shaped how he once spoke and acted in professional settings, especially when dealing with discussions about beings that others feared. And although he believed he was working toward protection, there was also a distance in his thinking, a separation between theory and personal consequence, which would later become impossible to maintain. Everything began to shift when his own child became connected to one of those very conditions he had once discussed in abstract terms. Because suddenly, what had been a subject of policy and debate became something that lived inside his own home, and the difference between observing danger and caring for someone affected by it created a kind of internal conflict that could not be solved with rules or logic alone. And so Reis found himself moving between two roles, one as a ministry worker who understood the system, and another as a father who needed to protect his son from that same system's harsh judgment. Opposite this structured and analytical mindset stood Hope Lupin, a woman whose background came from the non-magical world, often called the Muggle world by witches and wizards. And this difference in origin gave her a perspective that was shaped less by magical classification and more by emotional understanding, because she had grown up in an environment where differences were not always treated as threats, and where explanation often came before fear. And this allowed her to approach her son's situation with a kind of grounded patience that balanced Lyle's more cautious and protective instincts. Inside their home, these two perspectives created a kind of emotional balance, not perfect and not always easy, but steady enough to hold the family together. Because while Lyle focused on structure, rules, and prevention, Hope focused on warmth, reassurance, and the simple act of making sure Remus still experienced comfort in everyday life. And together, they formed a system that was constantly adjusting itself, like two sides of a scale trying to remain level under changing weight. When Remus was very young, there was a decision made between them that would shape every year of his early life. A decision that involved keeping his condition hidden from the wider wizarding world, not out of shame, but out of concern for what might happen if others learned the truth too soon, because they understood that knowledge in itself was not always enough to create understanding, and in many cases, information without compassion could lead to fear, exclusion, or even hostility, especially in a society where magical creatures and conditions were often judged quickly and harshly. This choice to keep his condition private was not made lightly, and it was discussed carefully in quiet rooms where voices stayed low and thoughts were weighed against possible outcomes, because they knew that revealing the truth could place Remus in danger of being labeled or separated from opportunities that other children would receive without question, such as education, friendship, and a normal place within the magical community. And so secrecy became not just a protective action, but a necessary structure that shaped how they lived from day to day. However, secrecy is never a simple solution, because it creates its own set of challenges. And in the case of the Lupin household, it meant that almost every aspect of life had to be considered twice, once for what was visible and once for what had to remain hidden. And this constant awareness influenced everything from conversations with neighbors to the way they prepared for certain nights, and even how they planned for the future, because they could never fully predict when the truth might become difficult to conceal. For Remus, this meant growing up in an environment where certain subjects were treated carefully, not with avoidance, but with controlled explanation. And while he was still too young to fully understand why these boundaries existed, he could feel their presence, as children often do, through the tone of conversations, the timing of activities, and the quiet adjustments that happened whenever the full moon approached. And even without being told directly, he began to sense that his life followed patterns that were different from those of other children. Lyle Lupin's experience at the ministry also added pressure to this hidden structure, because he was aware of how policies were formed and how quickly information could spread within official circles. And he knew that if Remus's condition became widely known, it would not simply remain a private matter, but could become a topic of institutional concern, which might lead to restrictions or decisions made without regard for the emotional well-being of a child. And this understanding made him even more determined to maintain control over who knew what and when. At the same time, Hope Lupin carried a different kind of awareness, one that was less about systems and more about human reactions. And she understood that fear often grows not from direct experience, but from stories and assumptions. And so she worried not only about official consequences, but also about everyday social interactions, about how other parents might respond, about how children might behave if they sensed something unusual, and about how easily a young life could become isolated simply because others did not understand it. Inside the home, this combination of concerns created a rhythm of preparation that repeated itself in subtle ways, not always visible to an outside observer, but deeply felt by those living within it, where certain days carried a quiet tension that built gradually as the lunar cycle progressed, and where the atmosphere would shift slightly without needing explanation, as if the house itself was responding to an internal clock that only its residents fully understood. Yet even with all this structure, there was still a strong current of affection that ran through the household, because Remus was not treated as a problem to be managed, but as a child to be raised with care, and both parents made efforts to ensure that his life contained moments of normal joy, whether through stories, learning, or simple shared time. And these moments were important because they prevented the home from becoming only a place of caution. Still, the emotional weight of secrecy was never far away, because hiding something so central to their daily life meant that there were parts of themselves they could not share with others, and this created a quiet distance between the Lupin family and the wider world, not because they wished to be separate, but because they felt it was necessary for protection. And over time, this separation became familiar, almost routine, even though it carried an underlying strain. There were also practical consequences to their decision, because living with a hidden truth required preparation for situations that other families never had to consider, such as how to explain absences, how to manage injuries or exhaustion after transformations, and how to ensure that no accidental exposure occurred during ordinary social contact. And all of these considerations required planning, patience, and constant attention, which placed emotional pressure on both parents in different ways. Lyle often carried the burden of responsibility in silence, trying to maintain a sense of control over circumstances that were never fully predictable, while Hope provided emotional stability, making sure that Remus did not grow up surrounded only by anxiety. And between them, they formed a partnership that depended not on perfection, but on constant adjustment, where each compensated for what the other could not always provide in the moment. As Remus grew slightly older, he began to notice that his family operated differently from others he might occasionally observe from a distance, not because anything was openly explained to him, but because children are observant and he could sense that certain topics were approached carefully, that certain times of the month carried different moods, and that his parents sometimes exchanged looks that communicated understanding without words. And although he could not yet interpret all of this, it gradually formed a pattern in his mind that set him apart from the more ordinary rhythms of childhood. Outside their home, the wizarding world continued without awareness of this private structure, moving through its usual routines of work, study, and magic. And within that larger system, there was little room for individual stories, unless they were made public, which meant that Remus's life remained completely unknown to most, even as it was being shaped in ways that were deeply connected to broader attitudes about magical creatures and safety. And this separation between private experience and public ignorance became another layer of his early existence. At times, Reis Lupin questioned whether secrecy could truly protect everything it was meant to protect, because he understood that hiding information could delay harm, but could not remove the underlying fears that society held. And yet he also recognized that revealing too much too soon might bring consequences that a child could not bear. And so he remained in a constant state of weighing possible outcomes, trying to find the least damaging path forward in a situation that offered no perfect answers. Hope, meanwhile, focused more on the present moment, on making sure that Remus's immediate experience was filled with enough stability and care that he could grow without being defined entirely by what he carried. And this difference in approach sometimes created quiet tension between the two parents, not in the form of conflict, but in the form of differing priorities that had to be balanced carefully so that neither fear nor denial would take over the household. Over time, this balance became the foundation of Remus's early environment, where protection and affection existed side by side with secrecy and caution. And while it was not an easy structure to maintain, it was one built out of necessity and love combined. And within that structure, a child was growing who would one day have to understand not only what had been done to him, but also the complex reasons why his parents chose the path they did, a path shaped by fear of the world outside and devotion to the child inside their home. Fenrir Greyback's mark on innocence. To understand why the early life of Remus Lupin carried such a heavy shadow, it is necessary to look more closely at the figure responsible for that first violent change in his existence, a man named Fenrir Greyback, whose actions were not the result of confusion or accident, but instead came from a clear and disturbing way of thinking that set him apart even among those considered dangerous in the wizarding world. Because while many magical threats act out of instinct, anger, or desperation, Greyback's behavior followed a purpose that made his crimes feel even more unsettling to those who studied them. Greyback did not view lycanthropy as something to fear or avoid, but instead treated it as something to spread, believing that turning others into werewolves was a form of strength or awakening. And this belief shaped the way he approached his targets, especially children, whom he saw as easier to influence and more likely to survive the transformation under conditions he controlled. And this idea alone reveals a mindset that removed compassion from his actions and replaced it with a cold and deliberate intention to change lives without consent, often in situations where the victims had no understanding of what was happening to them. In the case of Remus Lupin, this ideology became reality at a time when he was too young to understand the world around him, let alone the consequences of such an attack. And although the exact details of that moment remain partially hidden in the fog of early childhood memory, what is clear from all accounts is that Greyback's involvement was intentional, and that the attack was not random violence, but part of a pattern of behavior that reflected his belief system, one where fear and transformation were seen as tools rather than tragedies. What makes this event especially difficult to fully grasp is not only the act itself, but the fact that it was designed to permanently alter the future of a child who had no ability to consent or resist in any meaningful way. And this introduces a deeper layer of cruelty, because it means that Remus's entire life trajectory was redirected before he could form any understanding of who he was or what his life might have become without that interference. And this kind of forced change is something that leaves long-lasting effects, not only on the body, but also on the way a person is later seen by society and by themselves. After the attack, the immediate focus shifted entirely to survival and containment, as his parents were forced to quickly adapt to a reality that had changed in a single moment. And for Lyle and Hope Lupin, the emotional impact was not something that unfolded slowly over time, but something that arrived all at once, like a wave that disrupted everything familiar and replaced it with uncertainty, fear, and urgent responsibility, because they were no longer simply raising a child, but also trying to protect him from a condition that carried both physical danger and social consequences. The early days following the event were marked by a kind of emotional shock that is difficult to fully describe without imagining how quickly normal expectations can collapse when faced with something irreversible. And for Lyle, who had once worked in environments where he analyzed magical threats from a distance, the situation became painfully personal, because now the subject of his professional understanding had become the reality of his own household, and the distance that once existed between theory and lived experience disappeared completely. Hope Lupin experienced the situation in a different but equally intense way, because while she did not approach it through systems or classifications, she felt its impact through the emotional atmosphere of the home, through the silence that followed conversations, through the way future plans became uncertain, and through the way every small action seemed to carry new meaning. And in that environment, she became the steady presence that kept daily life from falling into complete disorder, even while she herself was dealing with fear and sadness that could not be fully expressed. For Remus himself, the consequences of Greyback's action were not something he could initially understand in clear terms, because at that stage of life, identity is still forming in simple fragments rather than complete ideas. And so what he experienced was not a story he could tell, but a condition he would gradually grow into, one that shaped how others reacted to him and how routines were built around his safety, even before he had the language to describe what was happening. As time passed, the emotional effects on the Lupin family began to settle into a more structured but still difficult routine, where each month carried a predictable turning point that required preparation. And this cycle became a constant reminder of the original event, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but in a steady rhythm that marked their lives with repetition. And this repetition made it impossible for the family to fully separate past and present, because the consequences of that single moment continued to return again and again. Lyle often found himself thinking about responsibility, not only in terms of what had happened, but also in terms of what could be done moving forward. And this led to an internal struggle where his desire to protect his son sometimes clashed with his understanding of how the wider magical world might react if the truth were known. And this tension created a mental burden that he carried quietly, rarely sharing it even within his own household, because he felt that maintaining control over the situation was part of his role as a parent. Hope, on the other hand, focused more on emotional survival, ensuring that Remus did not grow up in an environment defined only by fear, and she worked to create moments where the condition that shaped his life did not become the only thing that defined his experience, because she understood that children form their sense of self from a mixture of experiences, not just from difficulties. And so she placed importance on simple joys, gentle conversations, and small routines that helped maintain a sense of normal childhood within an otherwise complicated reality. However, even with these efforts, there was an unavoidable truth that gradually became clearer as Remus grew older, which was that his condition was not just a private matter within his home, but something that would influence how others perceived him if ever revealed. And this realization added another layer to his early development, because it introduced the idea that identity is not only something formed internally, but also something shaped by how society responds to it. And in his case, that response was often expected to be fear rather than understanding. Fenrir Greyback's role in all of this extended beyond the initial attack, because his ideology continued to affect how lycanthropy was viewed by many in the magical world, reinforcing negative associations that made it harder for individuals like Remus to be seen as ordinary children with a condition, rather than as threats. And this wider influence meant that the consequences of Greyback's actions were not limited to one family, but spread outward into the social attitudes that surrounded them. As Remus grew, the emotional weight of his situation began to take shape in ways that were not always obvious from the outside, but could be observed in subtle patterns, such as how he responded to certain times of the month with quiet awareness, or how he developed habits that reflected careful attention to his surroundings. And while these behaviors were not extreme, they were shaped by an early understanding that part of his life required caution. Inside the household, the emotional aftermath of the attack continued to influence daily interactions, because even when moments of calm returned, there was always an underlying awareness that the situation was not something that could be fully resolved or reversed. And this awareness shaped how decisions were made, how conversations were held, and how future possibilities were imagined, creating a family dynamic that was deeply connected to both care and concern. Lyle and Hope sometimes experienced the situation differently, but they were united in their commitment to Remus's well-being. And this shared responsibility meant that even when they disagreed on approach or emphasis, they continued to work together toward the same goal, which was to ensure that their son could grow up with as much safety and emotional stability as possible, despite the circumstances that surrounded him. Over time, what began as a response to a single event gradually became the foundation of their entire family structure, where routines were shaped around cycles that could not be changed, and emotional resilience became as important as physical protection. And within this structure, Remus's identity began to form not only from who he was as a child, but also from how his family adapted to the consequences of something that had been forced into his life long before he could understand it. And so, the mark left by Fenrir Greyback was not only physical or magical in nature, but also deeply emotional and social, influencing the way a child was raised, the way a family organized their lives, and the way a future was quietly shaped by events that began with violence and continued through years of careful adaptation, leaving behind a legacy that would take a long time to fully understand, even for those who lived within its consequences every day. Childhood behind locked doors. There are certain kinds of childhoods that do not unfold in open spaces or noisy streets, but instead take place within carefully controlled environments where every object, sound, and movement is arranged with purpose. And in the case of Remus Lupin, those early years were shaped by a pattern of life that most children in the wizarding world would never need to imagine. A pattern where the arrival of each full moon meant not celebration or observation, but preparation for separation, and where the idea of freedom quietly paused until the night had passed. As the lunar cycle moved forward each month, his home would subtly change its behavior, not in obvious ways at first, but in small adjustments that a growing child would begin to notice over time, such as doors being checked more carefully, windows being reinforced with protective spells, and certain rooms becoming more important than others. And while none of this was explained to him in frightening detail, the repetition of these actions created a sense of expectation that settled into his understanding of time itself. On the nights when the transformation could not be avoided, Remus was guided away from normal living spaces and placed into a specially prepared area within or connected to the home, a space designed not for punishment, but for safety, yet still shaped by restraint, because even protective structures can feel limiting when experienced from the perspective of a child who does not yet understand the full reason behind them. And so what adults saw as necessary precautions were experienced by him as separation from everything familiar. The structure of these nights was not random or improvised, but carefully arranged through repeated practice and planning, where magical protections were layered with physical containment, and where every detail was meant to ensure that no harm would come to anyone outside the controlled environment. And while this system succeeded in its purpose, it also created an atmosphere that felt different from the rest of the month, as if the household itself had entered a quieter and more guarded state. Before the moon reached its peak, there would be a gradual shift in how his parents interacted with him, where conversations became shorter but more gentle, and where routines were followed with increased attention. And although Remus did not always understand why these changes occurred, he learned to recognize the signs through repetition, much like a child learns the weather by observing patterns in the sky rather than being told about meteorological systems. When the transformation finally came, he was no longer present in the same way he was during ordinary days, because the condition that affected him during those hours removed awareness and control, leaving behind only what others had prepared in advance. And so the focus of those nights shifted entirely toward containment and protection, while the child himself remained unaware of what was happening until the cycle ended and consciousness returned in fragments. After each of these nights, there was a period of recovery and quiet rebuilding, where the household returned to its normal rhythm, but with a softness that suggested exhaustion beneath the surface. And during this time, Remus would wake with little understanding of what had occurred, only sensing that something had passed that required rest and patience. And his parents would guide him through this stage with careful attention, making sure he regained strength without drawing attention to details that were too complex for his age. The emotional structure of this cycle was as important as the physical one, because it required everyone in the home to manage not only safety, but also feelings that could not always be expressed directly. And this meant that silence often became part of the process, not as a form of neglect, but as a protective layer that prevented confusion or fear from growing too quickly in a mind that was still developing. However, silence has its own effects, especially on children, because when explanations are limited or delayed, the imagination begins to fill the gaps, And in Remus's case, this led to a growing awareness that certain parts of his life were not meant to be discussed openly. And while he did not interpret this as rejection, he did begin to sense that there were boundaries around his experience that others did not share. Inside the home, communication during these times often relied on gestures, routines, and familiar patterns rather than detailed conversation. And this created an environment where understanding was expressed more through action than through words, such as a hand guiding him to a specific room or a soft instruction to remain calm without further explanation. And while these moments were handled with care, they still reinforced the idea that something about him required special management. The containment spaces themselves were designed with safety in mind, using magical protections that prevented escape or accidental harm. And while they were effective in their purpose, they also created an environment that felt separate from ordinary life, almost like a boundary between two different versions of the world. One where Remus could exist freely during the day, and another where he had to be carefully separated from everything around him during the night. As a result of this structure, his early childhood developed around a rhythm that was different from most other children, where instead of only thinking in terms of days and weeks, he began to sense a deeper cycle that influenced his environment. And even though he did not fully understand the reason behind it, his body and mind adapted to the repetition in subtle ways, forming habits that reflected awareness of timing and change. Outside of these nights, there were long stretches of ordinary life, where Remus was able to experience typical childhood activities, such as learning basic magic, listening to stories, and spending time in quieter moments with his parents. And these periods were important because they provided balance, preventing his life from being defined solely by the more difficult parts of his condition. And during these times, he showed curiosity, intelligence, and a gentle personality that responded well to learning and interaction. Yet even in these calmer periods, there was an underlying awareness within the household that the cycle would return, and this awareness influenced the way time was perceived, because it meant that no part of the month was completely separate from what was coming. And this created a kind of emotional layering, where present moments were always gently connected to future responsibilities. Hope Lupin often tried to ensure that Remus did not grow up with fear as his primary association with these cycles, and she focused on maintaining warmth and normalcy wherever possible, making sure that he had experiences that were not defined by restriction, and her approach helped create emotional stability during periods that could otherwise have felt confusing or isolating. Reis Lupin, on the other hand, continued to focus on structure and prevention, making sure that all magical protections were maintained correctly and that no mistakes could lead to danger. And while his approach was more technical, it was also rooted in care, because every precaution he took was ultimately intended to protect his son from harm, even if it sometimes created distance in emotional expression. As Remus grew slightly older, he began to notice that his experience of these cycles was not shared by others, and this realization introduced a subtle form of separation, because even without being told directly, he could sense that most children did not live according to such patterns, and this awareness gradually influenced how he viewed himself in relation to the world around him. Loneliness did not arrive in a sudden or dramatic way, but instead formed slowly through repeated experiences of separation, where he would be placed apart from others during specific times. And although this was done for safety, it still created moments where he was physically removed from normal interaction. And over time, these repeated experiences contributed to a quiet sense of being different in a way that could not be easily explained. During the periods following each cycle, when recovery took place, there were moments when Remus would sit quietly, observing his surroundings with a thoughtful stillness that seemed older than his age, not because he lacked emotion, but because he was beginning to process the idea that some parts of his life operated outside of shared experience. And this reflection, even at a young age, began to shape his personality in subtle but lasting ways. He became observant, often paying attention to small details in conversations and environments, perhaps because early life had taught him that understanding patterns was important. and this habit of careful observation would later become one of his defining traits, allowing him to navigate complex situations with patience and thoughtfulness. At the same time, there were moments where he sought connection more quietly than other children might, not through loud demands or constant attention, but through small gestures, shared silence, or simple presence. And these behaviors suggested a desire for closeness that had to be balanced with an understanding that not all moments allowed for it. Within the household, both parents recognized these developing traits, and while they interpreted them differently, they both understood that Remus was adapting in ways that reflected his environment, and this awareness added another layer of responsibility to their actions, because they knew that the way they managed his early life would influence not only his safety, but also his emotional development. Over time, the structure of these early years became a defining framework for his identity, not because it limited who he could become, but because it influenced how he learned to move through the world, where caution and awareness were not imposed traits, but learned responses that helped him navigate a life shaped by cycles that others did not experience. And so, within the quiet boundaries of his childhood home, behind carefully maintained protections and carefully managed routines, a young boy grew up learning to exist within two different rhythms of life, one shared with the world during its ordinary hours, and another hidden within structured nights. And it was in this dual existence that the earliest foundations of his character were formed, shaped by separation, guided by care, and marked by a loneliness that would slowly become part of his understanding of what it meant to simply live, the wizarding world's silence. To understand the world that surrounded Remus Lupin beyond the walls of his home, it is necessary to look at how the wider wizarding society treated people affected by lycanthropy, because what happened inside his family was only one part of the reality he lived in, while another, much larger influence came from the collective attitudes of the magical community, where fear, misunderstanding, and long-standing prejudice shaped the way entire groups of people were seen, discussed, and quietly avoided in everyday life. Within wizarding society, lycanthropy was not treated as a simple medical condition that required care or structured support, but instead as something that carried heavy social weight, often associated with danger, unpredictability, and mistrust. And because of this, individuals who carried it were rarely seen as ordinary people facing a difficult situation, but more often as potential risks that others preferred not to engage with closely, even if no harm had ever been done by them personally. This kind of thinking did not appear suddenly or without reason, because it was built over many years of stories, warnings, and isolated incidents that were repeated until they formed a shared belief system, where fear became easier to pass on than understanding, and as a result, many witches and wizards grew up hearing about lycanthropy in ways that emphasized threat rather than humanity, and this early conditioning shaped how they would later respond when encountering it in real life, even if they never directly experienced it themselves. One of the most significant consequences of this collective fear was the lack of proper institutional support for children who were born with or later affected by the condition, because while the magical world had schools, ministries, and various systems for education and governance, there were very few structured resources designed specifically to help young individuals who needed both safety and inclusion, and this absence meant that families often had to manage everything privately, without guidance or official assistance that could have eased their burden. For a child like Remus Lupin, this meant that his early life was shaped not only by what was happening inside his home, but also by what was not happening outside of it, because there were no widely known programs that allowed him to attend school without fear of exposure, no public initiatives that encouraged acceptance, and no established protections that ensured children in his situation could grow up without being labeled, and so his family had to navigate a world that was not designed to accommodate him. The result of this gap in support was social invisibility, where individuals like Remus were not necessarily erased from existence, but were instead kept at the edges of public awareness, spoken about in general terms rather than personal stories, and rarely seen in everyday magical life, which created a situation where their presence was acknowledged in theory but avoided in practice. And this form of invisibility carried its own emotional consequences, even when it was not intended to cause harm. In many ways, invisibility is not the same as absence, because it still allows a person to exist physically while denying them full participation in the world around them. And for someone growing up, this creates a subtle but powerful sense of separation, where they may learn early on that certain parts of their identity are not meant to be shared openly. And even if no one directly says anything cruel, the lack of representation or acceptance can still send a clear message about belonging. As Remus grew older, even before he fully understood the social structures that shaped his world, there were already signs of how these attitudes affected the way people behaved around his condition. Because conversations about lycanthropy often carried a tone of caution, and when mentioned in public spaces, they were usually brief and uncomfortable, as though the subject itself was something best kept at a distance, and this environment naturally influenced how he would eventually understand how others might see him. What made this situation even more complicated was that children often learn about their place in the world not only from direct explanations, but also from observation. And so, even without being told anything negative directly, Remus could still sense patterns in how adults spoke, how stories were told, and how certain topics were avoided. And over time, these small signals contributed to a growing awareness that his condition placed him in a category that others treated differently. The wizarding world did not openly declare that individuals with lycanthropy did not belong, but belonging is not always defined by official statements, and more often, it is shaped by inclusion, participation, and the absence of fear in everyday interactions. And in this case, the repeated avoidance of the topic, combined with the lack of visible representation in normal social settings, created an environment where inclusion was limited, even if it was not explicitly denied. For families like the Lupins, this meant living with an understanding that revealing too much could lead to unintended consequences. Because once something becomes widely known in a society that is already uncertain about it, it can quickly turn into speculation, and speculation often leads to assumptions, and assumptions can lead to exclusion. And so silence became a practical strategy as much as an emotional burden, shaping how they interacted with the wider world. Inside magical institutions, there were discussions and policies related to dangerous creatures, but these were often focused on control and regulation rather than integration or support. And while some individuals within those systems may have held more compassionate views, the overall structure still reflected a priority on safety over inclusion, which meant that the needs of children like Remus were rarely addressed in a way that considered their emotional or developmental well-being. This lack of structured support meant that education for children affected by lycanthropy was not easily accessible in a normal sense, and while exceptions existed in rare and carefully managed circumstances, they were not part of a broader system designed to help, which left families to rely on personal arrangements and private solutions. And this added another layer of isolation, because education is often one of the main ways children connect with society outside their homes. As a result, the idea of participation in normal childhood experiences became complicated, because even something as simple as attending school involved questions of safety, exposure, and social reaction. And for Remus's parents, these questions were not abstract concerns, but daily considerations that influenced long-term planning, because they had to think not only about what was possible, but also about what would be safe in a world that might not respond with understanding. Over time, this environment created a kind of unspoken message that children like Remus would gradually absorb, not through direct instruction, but through consistent patterns of interaction, where absence of representation, careful avoidance in conversation, and limited social integration all combined into an impression that their condition placed them slightly outside the usual boundaries of acceptance. This message did not come in the form of spoken rejection, but rather through what was missing, through the lack of open discussion about inclusion, through the absence of visible examples of people living openly with the condition, and through the quiet assumption that it was something to be hidden rather than acknowledged. And for a child developing his sense of identity, these subtle signals could be just as powerful as words. Within this context, Remus's early understanding of himself was shaped not only by his immediate family's efforts to protect and care for him, but also by the broader social environment that surrounded them, which operated on different principles and often did not account for individual stories. And this contrast between private care and public silence created a layered experience of identity formation that was both supportive and isolating at the same time. Hope Lupin often tried to counterbalance this influence by focusing on emotional grounding within the home, ensuring that her son experienced kindness and normal interaction as much as possible, while Reis Lupin remained aware of how institutional systems functioned and how quickly social attitudes could affect personal outcomes. And together, they tried to build a protective space that could shield Remus from the harsher aspects of the outside world without completely disconnecting him from it. Still, no matter how carefully a family prepares its internal environment, it cannot fully control the messages that come from the world beyond its walls, and in Remus's case, those messages were often indirect but consistent, forming a background awareness that his condition was something others preferred not to engage with openly, and this awareness gradually influenced how he perceived social spaces, even before he had full understanding of their structure. As he grew, he would begin to notice that certain topics caused hesitation in adults, that certain conversations became quieter when specific subjects appeared, and that there was a general lack of visible examples of people like him living ordinary public lives. And while he may not have been able to name these observations clearly at a young age, they still contributed to a developing sense that his place in the wider world was uncertain. This uncertainty did not necessarily lead to fear, but it did create distance, because when a child senses that something about them is treated differently by society, even without direct criticism, they may begin to adjust their expectations of how they will be received outside their immediate environment, and this adjustment often happens gradually, becoming part of their personality without conscious decision. For Remus Lupin, this meant that the world beyond his home was not simply a place of opportunity and discovery, but also a place of unspoken rules and invisible boundaries, where acceptance was not guaranteed, and where understanding was not always extended to those who needed it most. And this realization, even in its early and unformed state, became part of the emotional foundation on which his later experiences would be built. And so, the silence of the wizarding world was not empty, but filled with meaning shaped by fear, caution, and long-standing habits of exclusion. And within that silence, a young boy continued to grow, carrying within him the quiet awareness that belonging was something the world did not always offer freely, even to those who had done nothing to earn its distance. The Hogwarts hope. For many children in the wizarding world, the moment a Hogwarts letter arrives is remembered as something almost magical in itself. A simple piece of parchment carrying a seal that opens the door to a completely new life. But for Remus Lupin, that moment carried a weight far deeper than excitement alone, because it arrived after years of careful living, shaped by secrecy, caution, and long stretches of emotional distance from ordinary childhood experiences. And so, when the letter finally came, it did not simply represent education, but the possibility of being seen as something more than the condition that had followed him since infancy. Up until that point, his world had been defined by boundaries that others rarely had to think about, where time was measured not only in school years or seasons, but also in cycles that dictated when he could safely exist in different forms of daily life. And so the idea of leaving home for a structured magical school seemed at first almost impossible, because institutions are not usually built with hidden conditions in mind, and families like his had learned through experience that most systems were not designed to accommodate his kind of reality. Yet, the acceptance to Hogwarts did come, and it did not arrive by accident, because behind that decision stood Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts at the time, a man known for making choices that often balanced rules with compassion. And in Remus's case, he recognized something that many others might have overlooked, which was that education itself could become a form of protection, structure, and even healing if handled with care. And so he made the rare decision to allow a student with lycanthropy to attend the school, even though it required additional planning and secrecy. This decision was not made lightly, because Hogwarts was a place filled with children, teachers, and daily interactions that could easily become complicated if even one risk was left unmanaged. And so Dumbledore's acceptance came with careful preparation, not as a simple permission, but as a structured arrangement designed to ensure safety for everyone involved, including Remus himself, who had lived most of his life with the understanding that his condition would limit his future opportunities rather than expand them. The emotional impact of this acceptance on the Lupin household was immediate, but it did not arrive as loud celebration, because their experience had taught them that every opportunity carried responsibility. And so instead of pure excitement, there was a quiet and thoughtful reaction, where hope and concern existed side by side. As they began to imagine what it would mean for their son to live in a school environment that was not designed with his condition in mind, even if special measures were taken to support him. One of the most important parts of this arrangement involved a hidden structure near Hogwarts, a place that would allow Remus to be safely separated during the nights of transformation. And this place became known among students through rumors and stories as the Shrieking Shack, a building on the outskirts of Hogsmeade that appeared abandoned and frightening from the outside, with broken windows, creaking wood, and an atmosphere that discouraged anyone from approaching it too closely. However, the truth behind the Shrieking Shack was very different from its appearance, because it was not simply an abandoned haunted building, but a carefully chosen location that served a specific purpose, designed to keep Remus away from others during moments when he could not control his actions, and it was connected to Hogwarts through secret passages that allowed him to be moved safely without exposing him to the rest of the school community, creating a system that balanced protection with secrecy in a way that few students or staff ever fully understood. Inside Hogwarts itself, preparations were also made to support his presence, although these preparations were not openly discussed among students, because revealing too much would have defeated the purpose of safety and discretion. And so most of the school continued its normal life without knowing that one of its students lived under conditions that required such careful planning. And this separation between visible life and hidden structure became part of Remus's experience from the very beginning of his time there. When he first arrived at Hogwarts, the emotional contrast compared to his earlier life was significant, because instead of being surrounded only by a small, controlled environment, he was now entering a large and vibrant community filled with other children his age, moving staircases, talking portraits, and endless corridors that seemed to stretch the idea of possibility far beyond what he had previously known. And yet, beneath this new environment, there remained the constant awareness that part of his life still required separation and secrecy. Albus Dumbledore's role in this arrangement was not simply administrative, because he also understood that acceptance without understanding would not be enough, and so his approach included a level of trust in Remus's ability to live within this complex situation, while also ensuring that the school's staff were prepared to maintain necessary protections without drawing attention to them. And this combination of openness and caution created a rare example of institutional flexibility in a system that often preferred strict structure over individual adaptation. For Remus himself, the arrival at Hogwarts marked a shift in emotional experience, because for the first time, he was placed in an environment where his condition did not define every aspect of his identity, even though it remained an important part of his life. And this allowed him to begin forming connections and experiences that were not centered solely around secrecy or limitation, but instead included learning, friendship, and participation in everyday school life. Yet even with this new opportunity, the arrangements surrounding his condition were always present in the background, shaping the rhythm of his time at Hogwarts in ways that were not always visible to others, because each month still brought moments when he had to be separated from normal activities. And during those times, he would follow the hidden path that led to the Shrieking Shack, where he would remain until it was safe to return. And although this process was carefully managed, it still reminded him that his experience of school life was different in ways that could not be fully removed. The existence of the Shrieking Shack itself became part of Hogwarts folklore, as students and villagers in Hogsmeade whispered about strange noises and mysterious events connected to the building, not knowing that what they heard was the result of carefully controlled circumstances designed to protect both Remus and those around him. And this misunderstanding created a layer of myth around something that was actually deeply practical in purpose, showing how lack of information often leads to stories that drift away from reality. Despite these hidden complexities, there was a growing sense of hope during this period, because for the first time, Remus was placed in a structured environment where learning and social interaction were possible on a daily basis. And this allowed him to begin developing skills and relationships that would have been difficult to form in isolation. And even though his condition still required careful management, it no longer completely defined the limits of his world. His early experiences at Hogwarts also revealed something important about his character, because in an environment filled with new people and opportunities, he began to show a quiet intelligence and patience that made it easier for him to adapt to academic life. And while other students might have approached school with more visible excitement or energy, Remus often observed first before fully engaging, as though he was carefully learning how this new world functioned before fully stepping into it. The presence of friendship also began to emerge during this time, although it would develop more fully later, because being surrounded by other children allowed him to experience interactions that were not shaped solely by family protection or secrecy. And this shift played an important role in helping him understand that connection with others was possible even within the limits of his condition, as long as trust and understanding were present. Hope within the Lupin family began to grow in a more visible way during this period, because Hogwarts represented not only education, but also a form of social inclusion that had previously seemed uncertain. And while there were still concerns about safety and emotional strain, the idea that Remus could attend a respected magical school offered a sense that his future was not completely restricted by the circumstances of his early life. At the same time, Reis Lupin continued to approach the situation with careful analysis, ensuring that every aspect of the arrangement remained secure and functional. And while his approach was more technical, it also reflected a deep sense of responsibility, because he understood that any failure in the system could have serious consequences, and so he remained attentive to details that others might not notice. As the school year progressed, the balance between visible life and hidden structure became more familiar to Remus, and while it never disappeared, it gradually became something he learned to live with rather than something that defined every moment of his experience. And this adjustment marked an important stage in his emotional development, because it showed that even within constraints, a broader life could still exist. Looking back at this period, it becomes clear that the acceptance into Hogwarts was not simply an educational opportunity, but a turning point that altered the direction of his life in a meaningful way, because it introduced him to a world where he could exist beyond isolation, even if only partially, and where his identity could begin to expand beyond the boundaries that had previously been set around him. And so, within the walls of a castle filled with magic, memory, and hidden passageways, a new chapter quietly began for Remus Lupin, one shaped by cautious planning, rare compassion, and a fragile but growing sense of hope that his life might include more than the silence and separation that had once defined it so completely. Friendship in the shadow of secrets. When Remus Lupin first stepped into the social world of Hogwarts, beyond lessons and structured routines, what he entered was not only a place of learning, but also a place where identity slowly reveals itself through shared moments. And it was in this environment that he began to form connections with three boys who would shape much of his school life: James Potter, Sirius Black, and Peter Pettigrew, each of them bringing their own personality, energy, and insecurities into a friendship that would grow in ways none of them could fully understand at the beginning. At first, these bonds did not appear as something significant or life-changing, because they started in simple situations that are common in schools, such as shared seats in classrooms, group assignments that required cooperation, and casual conversations in hallways where students passed time between lessons. Yet, over weeks and months, these small interactions began to build familiarity, and familiarity slowly turned into trust, and trust eventually became friendship that felt natural, even without formal definition. James Potter was often the most openly confident of the group, someone who seemed comfortable taking initiative and speaking without hesitation, and while this sometimes made him appear bold or even reckless in certain situations, it also made him approachable in a way that drew others toward him, including Remus, who found that James's energy created a kind of balance against his own, more careful and observant nature, allowing conversations between them to flow in ways that felt easy rather than forced. Sirius Black, on the other hand, carried a different kind of presence, one that combined charm with intensity, as though he was always slightly aware of breaking away from expectations placed on him before he even arrived at Hogwarts. And this sense of resistance to authority and tradition gave him a personality that felt unpredictable, but also deeply engaging, which made interactions with him both exciting and, at times, challenging to navigate, especially for someone like Remus, who tended to think before speaking. Peter Pettigrew appeared quieter compared to the others, often observing more than he contributed at first, but this did not mean he lacked awareness or presence, because his attention to detail and desire to be included created a different kind of role within the group, one that supported the dynamic in ways that were not always immediately visible. And over time, this balance of personalities formed a structure where each individual had a place, even if those places were not always equal in visibility or confidence. As these friendships developed, Remus found himself experiencing something he had rarely felt in such a consistent way before, which was the ability to interact with others without immediate concern about how his condition might define the moment. And this created a sense of emotional relief that was subtle but meaningful, because it allowed parts of his personality that had previously been quiet to emerge more naturally in conversation, laughter, and shared experiences. However, beneath this growing sense of belonging, there remained a constant internal awareness that his situation was different from theirs, and this awareness did not disappear simply because friendship existed, but instead remained present in the background of every interaction, shaping how he chose what to share and what to keep hidden. And this created a complex emotional balance, where connection and secrecy existed side by side in every relationship he formed. The decision to hide his condition from his friends was not made out of distrust, but out of concern for how they might react if they learned the full truth. Because even though they were kind and loyal in many ways, he understood that fear can appear in unexpected moments, especially when people are confronted with something they do not fully understand. And so he carried this secret quietly, not as a rejection of them, but as a form of protection for both sides. This secrecy, however, was not without emotional cost, because it meant that even in moments of laughter or shared adventure, there was always a part of him that remained slightly apart, observing rather than fully participating in openness. And this created a quiet tension within him that required constant awareness, as he had to carefully decide how much of himself could safely be shown without risking the stability of the relationships he was beginning to value. The group that formed around James, Sirius, Peter, and Remus eventually became known informally among students as a close circle, often seen together in different parts of the castle grounds, exploring corridors, discussing plans, or simply enjoying time away from structured lessons. And while to others they might have appeared like any other group of friends, within their shared experiences, there was a growing sense of unity that went beyond casual association. Within this circle, Remus often found himself acting as a stabilizing presence, someone who listened carefully before responding. And this role developed naturally, rather than by intention, because his early life had taught him to observe situations before acting. And this habit made him someone who could often understand emotional undercurrents within conversations that others might overlook, even if he rarely pointed them out directly. Despite the warmth of these friendships, there were moments when fear would quietly enter his thoughts, not as a constant anxiety, but as a background awareness that certain discoveries could change everything. And this fear was not focused on mistrust of his friends, but rather on the possibility of misunderstanding, because he knew that knowledge of his condition might not be enough to ensure acceptance without hesitation or concern. As time passed, the bond between the four boys deepened through shared experiences that included both ordinary school life and more adventurous activities. And these experiences created memories that strengthened their connection, but also increased the emotional weight carried by Remus, because the closer he became to them, the more he felt the importance of maintaining the secret that allowed those friendships to exist without complication. James and Sirius, in particular, often brought energy and spontaneity into their interactions, encouraging exploration and curiosity, while Peter tended to follow along with quieter agreement. And together, they created a dynamic that often led to moments of excitement and unpredictability, which Remus sometimes enjoyed fully, but at other times experienced with careful awareness of his own limitations and hidden responsibilities. The fear of discovery remained a subtle but persistent presence throughout these years, especially as adolescents began to shape their identities more clearly, because growing older meant that physical and emotional changes became more noticeable and shared spaces became more complex, increasing the possibility that secrets could be accidentally revealed through observation or circumstance rather than intention. There were times when Remus would find himself carefully avoiding situations that might expose his condition, even when those situations seemed harmless to others. And this required a level of constant attention that most of his friends did not need to consider, which added another layer of separation within the friendship, not through distance in affection, but through difference in experience. At the same time, the loyalty shown by James, Sirius, and Peter created moments of reassurance that made it easier for Remus to believe that even if the truth were ever revealed, there was a possibility of understanding rather than rejection, and this possibility became an important source of emotional strength, even if it remained uncertain and untested. The Marauders, as they eventually became known through their shared identity and activities, represented both comfort and complication in Remus's life, because while they provided him with companionship and a sense of belonging that had been missing in earlier years, they also made the secret he carried feel heavier, since the value of what he might lose became more apparent as his attachment to them grew stronger. Within this balance of joy and concern, Remus developed a way of interacting that combined openness with caution, allowing him to participate in friendship while still maintaining boundaries around parts of himself that he believed needed to remain hidden. And this approach became a defining feature of his adolescent years, shaping how he moved through both social and personal experiences. There were moments when he would observe his friends during quieter times, noticing how easily they expressed themselves without hesitation. And while he appreciated this freedom, it also reminded him of the complexity of his own situation, where even simple honesty required careful consideration of consequences. And this difference in experience created an internal contrast that he carried silently. As the years progressed, the group continued to grow closer, sharing more time together and forming traditions that became part of their identity within Hogwarts. And although these experiences strengthened their bond, They also increased the emotional importance of the secret Remus held, because every shared memory made the possibility of loss feel more significant. Yet despite this underlying tension, there was also genuine happiness within these friendships, moments where laughter was effortless, where understanding required no explanation, and where Remus could, for brief periods, feel less defined by the condition that had shaped his early life. And these moments became important anchors that helped him navigate the more difficult aspects of his existence. In the quiet spaces between adventure and routine, he often found himself reflecting on how unusual it was to experience such closeness while still carrying something he could not reveal. And this reflection did not lead to withdrawal, but rather to a deeper appreciation of the fragile nature of trust, where connection existed not because everything was known, but because enough was understood to allow it to continue. And so, within the shifting atmosphere of Hogwarts, among moving staircases and changing seasons, a group of friends formed a bond that was both ordinary and extraordinary, shaped by laughter and loyalty, but also by silence and careful protection. And at the center of this balance stood Remus Lupin, learning how to exist between truth and concealment while holding on to something he had never truly known before, which was the feeling of being accepted, even if only within boundaries that had to be carefully maintained. The full moon within school walls. Inside Hogwarts, life for most students followed a rhythm that felt stable and predictable, shaped by lessons, meals in the Great Hall, and the changing seasons that could be seen through tall windows and castle grounds. Yet for Remus Lupin, there was another rhythm hidden beneath all of this, one that did not appear on timetables or schedules, but instead followed the slow and steady movement of the moon. And every time that cycle reached its peak, the entire structure of his school life had to shift in ways that were carefully planned but never fully visible to those around him. The system that allowed him to remain at Hogwarts during these periods was not simple, nor was it something that could be explained to students in ordinary terms, because it relied on layers of preparation that combined magical security, careful timing, and complete secrecy, all designed to ensure that no one would accidentally come into contact with him during the most dangerous hours. And while most of the school continued its normal activities without awareness, a small group of adults worked quietly in the background to make sure everything functioned without interruption. As the full moon approached each month, Remus would begin to feel changes that others could not notice, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but in subtle shifts that built slowly over time. And these changes were not only physical, but also emotional, creating a sense of anticipation that was difficult to describe, as if his body understood the cycle even before his mind fully acknowledged it. And this awareness became part of his experience of time at Hogwarts, marking certain days with a quiet heaviness that only he seemed to carry. On the evening when the transformation could no longer be delayed, he would be guided away from the main areas of the castle through hidden passages that were known only to a few trusted individuals. And this journey was always carried out with careful attention to timing, so that no other students would see or suspect anything unusual. And while the corridors of Hogwarts were often full of movement and conversation, these moments felt almost completely silent for him, as if the world itself was pausing to allow this hidden process to take place. The destination of this journey was a remote structure outside the main grounds, a building that appeared abandoned and unstable from the outside, with broken windows, uneven walls, and an overall appearance that discouraged curiosity. And this place, known as the Shrieking Shack, had developed a reputation among students and villagers as something dangerous or haunted, because strange sounds were sometimes heard coming from within, especially during certain nights of the month when the wind carried voices that seemed unexplainable. However, what most people did not know was that the Shrieking Shack was not simply a place of fear, but a carefully selected location that served a very specific purpose, because its isolation and condition made it ideal for containing magical disturbances without risk to others, and its connection to secret passages allowed Remus to be moved there without exposure, creating a controlled environment where the transformation could occur without endangering the wider school community, even though the experience itself remained deeply difficult for him. Inside this space, protections had been placed to ensure that he could not leave during the transformation, not as a form of punishment, but as a necessary safeguard. And while these measures were effective in preventing harm, they also created an environment that felt separate from normal life, reinforcing the idea that this part of his existence had to be kept apart from everything else. And over time, this separation became something he learned to accept, even though it never became easy. When the transformation began, Remus would lose awareness of himself in a way that removed all connection to his daily identity. And what followed was a process that could not be remembered clearly afterward, because the mind that experienced those hours was not the same one that attended classes, spoke with friends, or studied spells. And this division created a kind of gap in his life, where time passed without personal memory, leaving only traces of exhaustion and recovery in its place. After each cycle ended, he would return to consciousness in a state that required rest and gradual recovery, often finding himself in a quiet space where the immediate danger had passed. And during these moments, there was always a period of adjustment where his body and mind slowly reconnected with his normal sense of self. And this transition was never immediate, but instead unfolded in stages that required patience and care from those who helped him. The physical effects of repeated transformations were not something that disappeared quickly, because each cycle placed strain on his body that accumulated over time. And although he was young and able to recover more easily than an adult might, there was still a noticeable impact that required attention, especially in the days that followed, when strength returned gradually and normal activities had to be resumed with caution. Emotionally, the experience carried an even deeper weight, because even though he did not remember every detail of what happened during the transformation itself, he was still aware of the pattern of separation and return. And this awareness created a complex relationship with time, where certain nights were associated with absence and recovery, while the days around them were shaped by preparation and adjustment, forming a cycle that became deeply embedded in his understanding of life at Hogwarts. The existence of this hidden structure created a duality in his identity, because during most of the month, he was simply a student among others, attending lessons, completing assignments, and participating in school life. But during specific times, he became someone who had to be removed from that environment entirely. And this contrast between ordinary participation and necessary isolation created a sense of living two different versions of existence within the same space. Among his classmates, there was no awareness of this dual life, because everything was designed to ensure that his condition remained hidden. And so to others, he appeared to be a quiet and intelligent student who sometimes missed activities for reasons that were never fully explained. And while occasional absences might have been noticed, they were not questioned in detail, because Hogwarts was a place where many students had their own personal circumstances that were not always shared openly. The emotional strain of maintaining this separation was not always visible on the surface, but it influenced how Remus experienced his friendships, studies, and daily routines. Because even in moments of enjoyment or achievement, there was a background awareness that certain parts of his life had to remain undisclosed. And this awareness required constant attention, making even simple interactions slightly more complex than they might have been for others. The Shrieking Shack itself became more than just a location, because over time it represented both safety and restriction at the same time, offering protection from harm while also reinforcing the idea that this aspect of his life could not exist freely within normal spaces. And this dual meaning made it emotionally significant in ways that were difficult to fully express, even as it served an essential function in keeping everyone safe. For Remus, moving between the castle and this hidden structure each month created a pattern that divided his experience of school life into distinct phases, where one part was filled with learning, friendship, and exploration, while the other was defined by isolation and recovery. And this separation became something he had to navigate repeatedly, learning how to adjust mentally and physically as each cycle came and went. Despite the difficulty of this arrangement, there were also moments of gratitude within it, because without this system, he would not have been able to attend Hogwarts at all. And so even though the experience carried challenges, it also represented an opportunity that might not have existed otherwise. And this realization added another layer of emotional complexity to his situation, where appreciation and difficulty existed together in the same experience. The adults responsible for managing this process worked quietly and carefully, ensuring that each transition was handled smoothly, and while their efforts were rarely visible to students, their presence was essential in maintaining the balance that allowed Remus to remain at the school. And this behind-the-scenes coordination reflected a level of trust and responsibility that extended beyond ordinary educational arrangements. As time passed, Remus became more accustomed to this dual structure of his life, learning how to move through each phase with increasing familiarity. And while it never became something simple or easy, it did become something predictable. And in that predictability, there was a small sense of stability that helped him navigate the more difficult aspects of his condition. Yet even with this stability, there remained an emotional tension that could not be fully removed, because each cycle reminded him that part of his identity was separated from normal experience during certain times. And this awareness shaped how he viewed himself within the larger environment of Hogwarts, where he was both included and set apart at different moments. And so, within the ancient walls of the castle and the hidden structure beyond its grounds, Remus Lupin lived through a pattern that combined ordinary education with extraordinary circumstance, where learning and isolation existed side by side, and where the rhythm of the moon quietly determined the shape of his life, creating a reality that was both carefully managed and deeply personal, marking each month with a cycle that defined not only his time at school, but also the way he understood what it meant to exist between two very different worlds. The burden of normality. Within the long corridors of Hogwarts, where footsteps echoed differently depending on the time of day, and where sunlight shifted across stone floors like moving water, Remus Lupin learned early that survival in a place filled with other students was not only about keeping secrets, but also about learning how to appear as though nothing inside him required special attention. And this effort, though never spoken aloud, became one of the most consistent parts of his daily life, shaping how he walked, spoke, and even how long he allowed himself to hesitate before answering a question in class. To most students around him, he seemed quiet but capable, someone who blended into the background of academic life without drawing unnecessary attention. And this was not because he lacked personality or interest, but because he had developed a careful awareness of how easily difference could be noticed in a crowded environment. And so, he learned to adjust himself in subtle ways, choosing when to speak and when to remain silent, not out of fear, exactly, but out of an instinct that had formed over years of understanding that visibility could sometimes carry consequences. In classrooms, this awareness became especially important because lessons at Hogwarts demanded participation, and participation meant being observed, and being observed meant the possibility of being interpreted in ways he could not fully control. And so Remus often chose to rely on preparation rather than spontaneity, studying material thoroughly before class so that when questions were directed toward him, his answers would come with ease rather than hesitation, giving the impression of natural intelligence rather than careful calculation. Over time, this approach led to academic success, and while others might have seen his strong performance as simply a sign of talent, for him it was also a method of stability, because excellence provided structure in a life that often felt divided into sections that required different forms of attention. And so studying became not only an educational activity, but also a form of emotional grounding, something predictable that he could control when other parts of his life felt less certain. This reliance on academic focus gradually turned into a pattern where books, assignments, and written work became safe spaces where he could fully engage without needing to manage how others perceived him beyond the quality of his results. And in this environment, he discovered that knowledge could act as a shield, not in a magical sense, but in a social one, because being recognized as reliable and capable often reduced the need for further explanation. However, this same pattern also created distance between him and those around him, because while he was present in conversations and group activities, there was always a part of his attention directed inward, monitoring how much of himself he was revealing, and this constant self-awareness gradually shaped his emotional responses, leading him to develop a calm exterior that sometimes made others assume he was unaffected by situations that, in reality, he was carefully processing internally. As friendships and social interactions became more frequent during his years at Hogwarts, this internal monitoring grew more complex, because now he was not only managing how he appeared in academic settings, but also how he behaved in casual moments, such as shared meals, group discussions, or simple time spent in common rooms. And in each of these situations, he carried an awareness that even small actions could contribute to how others formed their understanding of him. This continuous adjustment slowly influenced his emotional behavior, leading him to express feelings in more controlled ways, not because he lacked emotion, but because he had learned that showing too much at the wrong time could lead to questions he was not ready to answer. And so over time, he developed a kind of emotional restraint that allowed him to remain composed, even in situations where others might react more openly. What made this particularly complex was that Hogwarts itself was a place filled with strong personalities, sudden changes, and frequent moments of unpredictability. And within such an environment, maintaining consistency required effort, because while other students might express frustration, excitement, or curiosity without hesitation, Remus often filtered his reactions through a layer of consideration that weighed what was appropriate, what was safe, and what might draw unnecessary attention. This process of constant internal evaluation created what could be described as a quiet form of emotional separation, where he learned to step slightly outside his immediate feelings in order to observe them before responding. And while this skill helped him maintain control in social situations, it also meant that he sometimes experienced emotions with a slight delay, as though they had to pass through an internal checkpoint before being fully expressed. At the same time, there was an ongoing internal struggle that never fully disappeared, a conflict between the desire to be accepted without conditions and the need to protect parts of himself that he believed others might not understand. And this struggle did not present itself as a single, dramatic choice, but rather as a continuous balancing act that influenced even the smallest decisions, from what he chose to say in conversation to how much of his personal life he allowed others to see. In moments of solitude, this internal conflict became more noticeable because without external distractions, his thoughts would often return to questions about identity, belonging, and the possibility of being fully known by others without fear of rejection. And while he rarely allowed these thoughts to overwhelm him, they remained present enough to shape his understanding of relationships and trust. The effort to appear ordinary among his peers was not about pretending to be someone else, but about carefully managing how much of his reality was visible at any given time. And this required constant awareness of social context, because what might be acceptable in one situation could feel risky in another. And so he developed a habit of observing before engaging, allowing him to understand the tone of a situation before fully participating in it. Over time, this habit became so natural that it influenced his personality in subtle ways, making him appear calm and thoughtful, even in situations that might otherwise encourage impulsive reactions. And while this trait was often seen by others as maturity, for him it was also the result of long-term adaptation to circumstances that required careful attention to detail. Despite his academic success and social integration, there remained moments when the weight of maintaining this balance became more noticeable, especially during times when he felt more aware of the distance between his public self and his private reality. And in these moments, he would sometimes experience a quiet sense of exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the ongoing need to manage perception. Even so, he continued to participate in school life, because Hogwarts was also a place where he experienced genuine connection, learning, and growth. And these positive aspects provided motivation to continue navigating the challenges that came with his situation, creating a layered experience where difficulty and enjoyment existed at the same time, rather than cancelling each other out. The presence of friends and shared experiences added another dimension to this balance, because while he valued these relationships deeply, they also increased the importance of maintaining his carefully constructed sense of normality. Since the more he cared about others, the more he felt responsible for ensuring that nothing about him disrupted the stability of those connections. This sense of responsibility sometimes created internal pressure, because it required him to think not only about his own needs, but also about how his actions might influence the perceptions and emotions of those around him. And this expanded awareness of social impact contributed to his tendency toward caution and measured behavior. Yet within this careful structure, there were also moments where he allowed himself to relax slightly, especially during times when the environment felt safe enough that constant self-monitoring was not necessary. And in these moments, he could experience brief periods of ease, where he was not actively managing how he appeared, but instead simply existing within the moment alongside others. These moments, though temporary, played an important role in maintaining his emotional balance, because they reminded him that connection did not always require effort, and that acceptance, even in limited form, was possible without constant self-protection. And this realization helped sustain him through periods when the weight of his dual awareness felt heavier. As adolescence continued, the internal tension between identity and acceptance did not disappear, but instead became more defined, because growing older meant becoming more aware of long-term implications, including the understanding that the choices made during school years could influence how one would be seen in the future. And this awareness added another layer of consideration to every decision he made. Despite all of this, Remus Lupin continued to move through his years at Hogwarts with a steady presence that often led others to see him as reliable and composed, while only he fully understood the amount of effort required to maintain that appearance. And this difference between perception and internal experience became one of the defining features of his school life. And so, within the shifting rhythms of Hogwarts, where days were filled with learning, conversation, and discovery, he lived through a quiet but constant negotiation between who he was, who he needed to appear to be, and who he hoped he might eventually become, carrying within him a sense of order built from discipline, awareness, and the ongoing effort to exist comfortably within a world that often demanded simplicity from something far more complex. The fragile illusion of safety. There are moments in every hidden life when the careful structure that keeps everything in place begins to feel slightly unstable, not because it has failed, but because maintaining it for too long starts to wear down even the most practiced control. And in the case of Remus Lupin, those moments did not arrive with dramatic collapse or sudden exposure, but instead appeared quietly within ordinary school days at Hogwarts, when small details, almost, but not quite, revealed something that was meant to remain unseen. One of the most delicate aspects of his existence during those years was the constant effort required to ensure that no pattern could be recognized by those around him, because patterns are what people naturally notice when they begin to wonder about consistency, and consistency is often what leads to questions, and questions are what he had learned to manage carefully, even before they were fully formed. And so his life became a quiet exercise in avoiding repetition that might draw attention to something deeper than what was visible on the surface. There were times when his absences from shared activities created subtle curiosity among classmates, not in an aggressive or confrontational way, but in the natural human tendency to notice when someone is not present as expected, especially in a school where students often spent large amounts of time together. And while most of these observations remained casual and unspoken, they still existed as small points of uncertainty that he had to remain aware of. On a few occasions, these uncertainties came close to becoming questions that could have led to uncomfortable attention, such as moments when a classmate might mention a pattern in missed lessons or a change in behavior that seemed slightly unusual compared to others. And in those instances, Remus would find himself carefully responding in ways that redirected conversation without drawing further focus, relying on calm tone and simple explanations that discouraged further inquiry. Even though these situations were handled without open conflict, they created a quiet internal tension, because each close call reminded him that the structure supporting his secrecy was not unbreakable, but instead depended on constant attention. And this awareness meant that even ordinary interactions carried a hidden layer of caution that most students never needed to consider. As time passed, the emotional effort required to maintain this balance began to build in ways that were not immediately obvious, because it did not appear as sudden stress or visible exhaustion, but rather as a steady accumulation of awareness that influenced how he experienced even relaxed moments, where part of his attention remained slightly detached, ready to adjust if a situation shifted unexpectedly. This ongoing alertness became a kind of background condition in his daily life, where he learned to monitor not only what he said, but also how others might interpret small differences in behavior. And while this skill helped him avoid exposure, it also meant that he rarely experienced complete ease in social settings, because even during laughter or conversation, there was a part of him that remained observant. At Hogwarts, where students often formed strong opinions quickly, and where rumors could spread through corridors with surprising speed, this kind of awareness became especially important, because even minor misunderstandings had the potential to grow into speculation, and speculation was something he needed to prevent at its earliest stage, long before it could turn into something more difficult to control. There were also moments when his condition indirectly influenced how others perceived him, even without knowing the truth, such as times when he appeared tired after certain nights, or when he was less present in group activities during specific periods. And while these signs were not obvious enough to reveal anything directly, they were still noticeable enough to create small gaps in understanding that others might fill with their own interpretations. Most classmates did not question these gaps deeply, partly because Hogwarts was a place where students often had personal circumstances that were not fully shared. But even so, Remus remained aware that curiosity could grow over time if certain patterns became too noticeable, and so he worked quietly to ensure that no consistent explanation could easily be formed by others observing him over long periods. The emotional strain of this long-term concealment did not remain constant in intensity, but it never fully disappeared either, because even during calm periods, there was an underlying awareness that any unexpected change could bring attention closer than desired, and this created a steady sense of responsibility that shaped how he moved through each day. One of the most challenging aspects of this experience was that fear itself gradually became familiar, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but as a normal part of thinking ahead, where he would naturally consider how situations might be interpreted by others before they even occurred. And over time, this form of anticipation became so common that it blended into his usual thought process. What made this particularly complex was that fear in this context was not always linked to immediate danger, but rather to the possibility of being seen differently by those around him. And this kind of fear is often more persistent because it is tied to identity rather than a single event, making it something that lingers in the background of many ordinary situations. There were moments when this awareness felt heavier, especially during periods when social interaction was more frequent or when group activities required extended presence among others, because in such situations, He had to maintain a consistent version of himself for longer periods, and this required continuous attention that could become tiring over time. Despite this, he did not withdraw from social life entirely, because he valued the connections he had formed, and these relationships provided a sense of normality that balanced the more difficult aspects of his situation. But even within these friendships, there remained an internal boundary that he could not fully cross, which kept part of his experience separate from what others knew. On rare occasions, there were near discoveries that came closer to revealing more than intended, such as moments when someone might have accidentally entered a space or noticed something at an unexpected time. And in these instances, the situation would require quick adjustment, not through panic, but through careful control of response and timing, ensuring that nothing unusual remained visible long enough to raise deeper concern. These close moments often left a lingering effect afterward, not in the form of visible reaction, but as internal reflection, where he would mentally revisit what had occurred and consider how narrowly the situation had been managed, reinforcing the understanding that secrecy was not something static, but something that required continuous maintenance. Over time, this repeated experience of near exposure contributed to a gradual normalization of fear, not because he became comfortable with it, but because he became accustomed to its presence. And this normalization meant that fear was no longer an occasional response, but a regular part of how he interpreted certain situations, especially those involving unpredictability or lack of control. Within this framework, the idea of rejection also began to take on a quieter form, because instead of being imagined as a sudden and dramatic event, it became something that existed as a possibility attached to many social interactions, and this possibility influenced how open he allowed himself to be, even in moments where openness might otherwise have felt natural. At the same time, there were periods where this awareness softened slightly, especially when interactions with trusted friends felt stable enough that he could temporarily set aside concerns about discovery. And during these times, he was able to experience parts of adolescence that were more relaxed and less focused on internal management, though these moments always remained temporary rather than permanent. What made his experience particularly complex was the contrast between outward appearance and internal reality, because to most observers, he appeared composed and steady, someone who managed school life without visible difficulty, while internally he was constantly adjusting and evaluating, ensuring that nothing about his condition disrupted the stability of his presence in the wider school environment. This contrast created a quiet form of emotional separation, where the version of himself that others saw did not fully reflect the effort required to maintain that image. And while this separation was not always emotionally painful, it did contribute to a sense of distance between inner experience and outward expression. As he moved further into adolescence, this distance became more structured in his mind, not as a conflict that needed resolution, but as a condition of living within his circumstances. And so he learned to navigate both layers of experience simultaneously, allowing him to function in social settings while still maintaining awareness of what needed to remain hidden. Even with all these challenges, there remained moments of genuine connection and comfort that reminded him that secrecy did not completely define his life, and these moments provided balance, allowing him to continue moving forward without becoming entirely consumed by the weight of constant caution. And so, within the long and shifting corridors of Hogwarts, where light and shadow changed with time and seasons, Remus Lupin lived through a delicate balance of presence and concealment, where every day required quiet attention to detail, and where the idea of safety was never fully absolute, but instead existed as something fragile, maintained through constant care, careful decisions, and the ongoing effort to ensure that what remained hidden would continue to stay just beyond the reach of discovery. The cost of hidden truths. By the time Remus Lupin had spent several years inside Hogwarts, something inside him had begun to change in ways that were not easy to see from the outside, because there were no sudden shifts or dramatic breaks in his behavior, but but instead a slow shaping of thought patterns and emotional habits that formed under the steady pressure of carrying a truth that could not be spoken. And while he continued attending classes, sharing meals, and taking part in school life like any other student, there was always an unseen layer of mental effort running beneath everything he did. Living with secrecy for such a long time does not simply mean hiding information. It gradually changes how a person thinks about themselves and others. Because when someone spends years deciding what can and cannot be shared, they begin to measure every interaction through the possibility of exposure. And in Remus's case, this meant that even simple conversations could carry a quiet sense of calculation, as if each sentence needed to be weighed before it was spoken, not because he wanted distance, but because he had learned that openness carried risk. At first, this way of thinking felt like something temporary, a protective habit that would only be needed until the right time came or until circumstances changed. But as the years continued, it slowly became part of how he naturally approached the world, and without realizing it, he began to separate his thoughts into categories, some that could be shared freely, and others that had to remain carefully contained. And over time, this separation became so familiar that it no longer felt like a conscious choice. One of the earliest emotional effects of this long-term concealment was a quiet form of self-doubt, not in a loud or obvious way, but in small questions that appeared during ordinary moments, such as wondering whether certain behaviors might seem unusual if observed too closely, or whether differences in routine might lead others to ask questions that he was not prepared to answer. And although these thoughts did not always dominate his mind, they were frequent enough to influence how he viewed himself in social spaces. This self-doubt did not come from others directly criticizing him, but rather from his own awareness of how fragile his situation was, because he understood that acceptance in his case was not guaranteed, and that it depended heavily on information that he could not safely share. And this created a subtle internal tension where he could not fully relax into the idea of belonging, even when he was surrounded by people he cared about. As time passed, this awareness began to shape his emotional distance from others in ways that were not always visible, because while he continued to interact and participate in friendships, there was often a part of him that remained slightly withdrawn, observing rather than fully engaging, not out of disinterest, but as a habit formed through years of careful self-monitoring. And this habit slowly influenced how deeply he allowed himself to invest in relationships. There were moments when he would notice that other students seemed to speak and act without the same level of internal filtering, expressing thoughts immediately and reacting to situations without pause. And while he understood that this was natural, it also highlighted the difference in how he experienced social interaction. Because for him, even spontaneous behavior required consideration of possible outcomes that others did not need to think about. This difference gradually contributed to a growing sense that acceptance in the world around him was conditional, even if it was never openly stated, because he realized that people often accepted what they could see and understand, and anything outside of that understanding could easily change how they viewed someone. And so he began to carry the awareness that belonging was not something fixed, but something that depended on what was known at any given moment. This realization did not make him withdraw completely from friendships, but it did influence how he experienced them internally, because while he valued the connections he formed, he also understood that they were built on partial knowledge. And this created a complex emotional balance where closeness and distance existed at the same time, even within relationships that felt warm and genuine on the surface. As friendships deepened over time, especially with those he spent the most time with, he began to notice how trust developed in layers, starting with shared experiences and gradually moving toward deeper understanding. But in his case, there was always a limit to how far that understanding could safely go. And this limit was not imposed by others, but by his own need to maintain secrecy, which meant that even trust had boundaries that could not be crossed. This created a unique emotional structure within his social life, where he could feel close to others without fully revealing himself, And while this allowed him to maintain relationships, it also meant that there was always a part of his identity that remained separate. And this separation became something he carried quietly, without expressing it directly to those around him. Over time, this pattern began to influence how he interpreted the actions and words of others, because he became more sensitive to moments where curiosity might arise, or where attention might shift in ways that could lead to questions. And this awareness made him more cautious in how he presented information about himself, even in situations that were unrelated to his condition. There were also emotional consequences that developed more gradually, such as a tendency to hold back personal expression in moments where vulnerability might have naturally appeared, not because he did not feel those emotions, but because he had learned that revealing too much could lead to uncertainty, and so he often chose restraint as a safer option, even when openness might have been more natural. This pattern of restraint sometimes created moments of internal conflict, where he would feel the desire to share something personal, but stop himself before doing so, not because of fear in the immediate sense, but because of a long-term habit of evaluating risk. And over time, this habit became so ingrained that it often occurred without conscious thought. Despite these internal limitations, he continued to value his friendships deeply, and these relationships played an important role in maintaining emotional balance, because they provided a sense of normality that existed alongside his more complicated internal experience. And this balance allowed him to remain connected to others, even while carrying the weight of secrecy. However, even within these friendships, there remained an unspoken structure that shaped how close he could become, because true openness requires the ability to share without restriction, and in his case, that was not always possible. And so he learned to navigate relationships in a way that allowed connection without complete exposure, creating a form of trust that was real but carefully managed. At times, this situation led him to reflect quietly on what it meant to be known by others, because he realized that being understood fully would require revealing parts of himself that he could not safely share. And this created a difficult question that did not have a clear answer, which was whether it was better to be partially known and accepted, or fully known and possibly rejected. This question did not lead to dramatic emotional breakdown or visible distress, but it did remain present in the background of his thoughts, influencing how he approached new relationships and how he maintained existing ones. And over time, it became part of his understanding of human connection in general, where knowledge and acceptance were not always aligned. Even so, there were moments when he experienced genuine ease within his friendships, where conversation flowed naturally and where he did not feel the need to actively manage how he was perceived. And these moments were important because they reminded him that connection was still possible, even within the limits he had set for himself. Yet after these moments passed, the awareness would often return quietly, bringing back the understanding that such ease was temporary and that maintaining relationships still required careful attention. And this cycle of ease and awareness became a familiar pattern in his emotional life. As he continued through his years at Hogwarts, this internal structure became more defined, not as a source of constant distress, but as a stable part of how he understood himself in relation to others. And while it did not prevent him from forming meaningful bonds, it did shape the depth and nature of those bonds in ways that were not always visible from the outside. And so, beneath the surface of an ordinary student life filled with lessons, conversations, and shared experiences, there existed a quieter reality shaped by long-term secrecy, where self-doubt, careful observation, and conditional acceptance formed an ongoing background to his daily existence. And within that reality, Remus Lupin continued to move forward, balancing connection and concealment in a way that allowed him to remain part of a world that he could never fully reveal himself to, even while becoming an important part of it. The man shaped by the boy who endured. By the time Remus Lupin reached adulthood, the story of his life no longer looked like a series of separate events, but instead formed a long connected line where each early experience quietly influenced what came after it. And when looking closely at the man he eventually became, it is difficult to separate the adult from the child he once was, because so many of his habits, choices, and emotional responses can be traced back to years spent learning how to survive within conditions that most people would never have to imagine, let alone endure. The early experiences that shaped him were not the kind that disappear with age, because they were not simple memories of childhood discomfort or passing difficulty, but instead long-term patterns of living that required constant adjustment. And these patterns slowly became part of how he understood himself, forming a foundation that influenced how he interacted with the world, even when the original circumstances were no longer present in the same form. As he grew older, the awareness of what he had lived through began to take on a different meaning, because childhood experiences often feel like something endured without full understanding. But adulthood brings reflection, and with reflection comes the ability to recognize how deeply those early years shaped emotional behavior, personal boundaries, and the way trust is formed. And in Remus's case, this meant recognizing that much of his calmness and caution were not simply personality traits, but responses developed over time as a way to manage uncertainty and protect both himself and others. The transformation of pain into wisdom is not a sudden process, nor is it something that happens through a single moment of realization, but rather through long periods of living with memory and consequence, where difficult experiences gradually become sources of understanding rather than only sources of hurt. And for Remus, this meant that the same parts of his life that once created fear and isolation later became the reason he developed patience, empathy, and a careful awareness of how others might be affected by unseen struggles. One of the most noticeable qualities that emerged in his adult life was his ability to remain calm in situations where others might feel overwhelmed, and this was not because he lacked emotion, but because he had learned over many years to observe first, respond later, and consider outcomes before acting. And while this approach may have seemed natural to those around him, it was actually built through long experience of living in environments where sudden reactions could create unintended consequences. This sense of restraint extended into how he treated other people, especially those who were struggling with their own difficulties, because he understood in a deeply personal way that not all pain is visible, and that many individuals carry burdens that are not immediately obvious from the outside. And this understanding shaped how he spoke, how he listened, and how he chose to support others without drawing unnecessary attention to their vulnerability. When he later took on the role of a teacher at Hogwarts as a defense against the dark arts professor, this quiet understanding became one of his most defining qualities, because he did not approach teaching only as a transfer of knowledge, but also as a form of guidance shaped by empathy and lived experience. And this allowed him to connect with students in a way that felt both calm and approachable, even when the subject matter itself involved danger and complexity. In the classroom, he often appeared composed and thoughtful, creating an environment where students felt safe asking questions and where mistakes were treated as part of learning rather than something to be feared. And this teaching style reflected a deeper belief that understanding comes not from pressure, but from patience and steady explanation. And this belief was rooted in his own life, where learning to understand himself had taken time and care rather than force. Outside of lessons, he carried himself with a quiet presence that did not seek attention, yet naturally drew respect, not because he demanded it, but because there was something steady in the way he observed and responded to the world around him. And this steadiness came from years of adapting to situations that required careful thought and emotional control, turning survival into a kind of internal discipline that remained with him even when the original reasons for it had changed. As an adult, he often reflected on how different his life might have been under other circumstances, not in a way that focused on regret, but in a way that acknowledged the path that had led him here. Because understanding one's own history is not about wishing it away, but about recognizing how it contributed to the person one becomes. And in his case, every stage of his early life had contributed to a deeper sense of awareness about both hardship and kindness. There were still moments when the weight of his past could be felt quietly beneath the surface of daily life, especially in situations that reminded him of earlier patterns of separation or caution. But instead of overwhelming him, these moments often became reminders of how far he had come and how much he had learned about managing both his own limitations and the expectations of the world around him. One of the most important changes that came with adulthood was the way he began to understand survival, not as something purely physical, but as something emotional and psychological as well. Because surviving difficult circumstances does not only mean enduring them in the moment, but also learning how to carry their effects into the future without allowing them to define every aspect of identity. And this balance became an important part of how he moved through life. In many ways, his ability to support others was shaped directly by his own experiences of being supported, observed, and carefully guided during earlier years. And this allowed him to recognize the importance of patience when dealing with students or individuals who were still learning how to manage their own challenges. And this recognition made his presence as a mentor feel grounded and genuine rather than distant or purely instructional. He did not present himself as someone who had overcome everything completely, because he understood that life is not a simple story of resolution, but rather a continuous process of adjustment. And this honesty, even when unspoken, created a sense of trust in those who interacted with him, because they could sense that his calmness was not based on detachment, but on understanding. There was also a quiet humility in the way he approached his role as an educator, because he did not see himself as separate from the struggles of others, but rather as someone who had simply learned how to move through them over time. And this perspective allowed him to remain approachable, even when dealing with subjects that required authority and structure. As years passed, the connection between his childhood and his adult identity became more clear in reflection, because what once felt like isolated experiences gradually revealed themselves as part of a larger pattern of development, where early challenges shaped long-term emotional awareness, and where survival became not just an outcome, but a foundation upon which later life was built. Yet despite everything he had experienced, there remained within him a consistent sense of care for others, a desire to ensure that those around him did not feel unseen or misunderstood in the way he once might have felt. And this desire often influenced how he chose to act in both professional and personal situations, guiding him toward patience even in moments of difficulty. In quieter moments of reflection, it becomes clear that his life was not defined solely by the condition he was born into or the challenges he faced, but also by the choices he made in response to those challenges. And these choices gradually shaped him into someone who valued understanding over judgment, stability over reaction, and empathy over assumption. The boy who once learned to survive through careful awareness eventually became a man who helped others navigate their own uncertainties, not by removing their struggles, but by showing that it is possible to move forward while carrying them. And in this transformation, there is a quiet continuity that connects every stage of his life into one steady narrative. And so, looking at Remus Lupin as an adult is not simply looking at a person who endured hardship, but at someone whose entire character was formed through the process of enduring, adapting, and learning, where each difficult moment became part of a larger understanding of what it means to live with both vulnerability and strength at the same time. And in the end, his legacy is not only found in what he survived, but in how he used that survival to guide, support, and quietly shape the lives of others who crossed his path. And now, as the story of Remus Lupin slowly settles into silence, we are left not with sharp endings, but with soft echoes of a life that was shaped long before it was fully understood, where a boy learned to live between hidden truths and quiet hopes, and where every step forward carried both the weight of what he endured and the fragile light of what he was still allowed to become. If we look back gently on his journey, we can see how fear and care often lived in the same spaces, how isolation could exist beside kindness, and how even in the most uncertain parts of his childhood, There were moments that carried the faintest sense of safety, like distant candlelight in a long, quiet corridor. Now, as you let go of these thoughts, imagine the world growing softer around you, like pages closing slowly in a book that no longer needs to be turned, and allow the rhythm of calm breathing to take the place of every heavy memory we have passed through together. And in that quiet space between waking and sleep, let there be only stillness and rest, and the gentle feeling that you are safe to drift away.